know.
So welcome back. We took a quick break, and now we're gonna get to the final part of our podcast. So I came up with a very interesting way to finish our conversation, and it's gonna be called pass or fail. And what we're gonna do, I have to actually walk back what I said about not offending or speaking ill of anyone, because some of these people are just outrageous. So what we're gonna do is that we're gonna take a book which has some type of claim or some type of premise, such as Jesus was this, and then we're gonna put it through the test and see if they pass or fail their own premise. And I have to say something because this one guy, I love him. He's very charismatic, but the kind of stuff he's saying is kind of out there. So I'm gonna read an article that he wrote for the Jerusalem Post. And again, we're not attacking him personally, we're attacking some of his ideas. So this is what my homeboy, Shmuley Boteach, wrote. And there's so many holes in what he's saying, but he's also a genius. So that's the thing. One thing I want our listeners to be aware of, that in Judaism, you can be many things at once, and you can believe in and hold many ideas within your mind. It's not always all or nothing. So this is what he wrote. And then we're gonna get back to does what he's saying pass the test or not. So this is before he even wrote the actual book. So as many of you know, he wrote the book Kosher Jesus, which was very controversial on both the Jewish and the Christian side. I read like 5 different like reviews from Christian authors, and they all slam him on all these points, but they miss the main point of what he's trying to say. So this is where coming from a Jewish perspective might be helpful. But again, a Jewish perspective that is open versus a Jewish perspective that just thinks everybody's a heretic if they don't agree with you. So this is what he wrote in the Jerusalem Post on February 7, 2006. And I'm going to read it with his bravado, because he's really good at communicating. Quote, Jesus Christ is the most famous Jew of all time, but is today remembered as a Christian. Surprisingly, the Jewish community has accepted this distortion of history and tends to regard Jesus as an apostate. How odd that the Jews will accept the Christian version of one of their brethren rather than seeking to discover the man entombed beneath the myth. Like a mummy whose bandages must be removed, 2,000 years of Christian gauze must be stripped away so we may discover the Jewish Jesus. We may do so by reading the original story of Jesus in the New Testament before it was modified by Pauline and Lucar editors who worked after the failed Jewish rebellion against Rome in years 66 to 70, and whose intention it was to make Jesus a less Jewish and more Roman, less a political rebel against Roman rule, and a more Jewish religious revolutionary who imbibed against a corrupt Jewish hierarchy. These Christian editors hid the real Jesus message of political revolution against Rome, thereby transforming him into a soundbite speaking do-gooder who loved Romans and hated his people. The real Jesus was a deeply religious Jew patriot who despised the Romans for their cruelty to his people and for their paganism. He never once abrogated the laws of Torah and expressly condemned those who advocated doing so. Matthew 5:18. Jesus walked on earth with a yarmulke and a beard. You can't say that unless you were there, because yarmulkes weren't a thing until like 200. So that's the first issue. We'll get to it. Rather than a halo and a cross. The portrayal of Jesus as being at odds with the Pharisees, the Jewish rabbinical leadership, that's also a misnomer. They were not rabbinical because the rabbinic system had not been fully flushed out. They were pro-rabbis, just like Jesus. So again, he doesn't know what he's talking about in some things. It's a later Christian device designed to implicate Jews in Jesus' death. The proof that Jesus was a committed Pharisee throughout his life can be gleaned from how nearly all his teachings are merely restatements of classical biblical and Pharisaic / Talmudic teachings. Again, he's incorrect. The Pharisees were one group of many groups. They almost died off, and only one Pharisee made it to the Sanhedrin of Yavne. So for him to say that the Pharisees and Talmudic rabbis are the same people, he's actually creating anti-Semitism and adding to the confusion. So, like our guest in one of our previous shows, Rabbi Asher Mesa said, Mr. Boteach is great on his, traditionalist leanings, but he's very poorly informed when it comes down to academic writings. Examples include some of Jesus' most celebrated sayings, like the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, which is a restatement of Psalm 3. The meek shall inherit the earth and delight themselves in the abundance of peace. Likewise, Jesus' pronouncement that if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn him the other also, Matthew 5:39. It's a statement of Lamentations 3:30. Let him offer his cheek to him who smites him. When Jesus is described by the Gospels as desecrating the Sabbath, he offers well-reasoned Talmudic arguments. Again, how can someone offer a Talmudic argument if the Talmud hasn't been written? So he's being anachronistic in what he's saying. He makes the Talmudic arguments for doing so, arguments based on sound Pharisaic teachings. As Chaim Maccabee, who's somehow Shlomo Boteach's greatest scholar of all time, writes in the Mythmaker, Jesus celebrated saying, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, which is found word by word in a Pharisee source where it used to support the rabbinical doctrine that saving of life takes precedence over the law of the Sabbath. Jesus shows no interest in founding a new religion or converting non-Jews. A point he makes repeatedly in the Gospels. Indeed, at various points, Jesus expressed contempt for Gentiles. So again, he's playing with the text because Matthew 10:5-7 and Matthew 15:22-26, most likely the story about the Syrophoenician woman who came to Jesus and he called her a dog. Again, if you take it literally, Jesus was anti-Gentile. If you take it in the way that it was intended, which he was talking in like very aggressive and like almost it's like a didactical thing to use the harshest terms, and all the prophets and everybody did. He was saying that if someone who's involved in paganism comes to the Israelites, which should follow the God of the Bible, why would the Israelites have mercy on them if they've been living a life of immorality? She said, I will take anything from you guys because you guys have the truth. And he says, your faith is the greatest because you're more knowledgeable than half of the people here. So he insults her, and then so that is a Talmudic thing, to pull someone with one hand and push them with the other, or the other way around. So again, he's not very familiar with the kind of language, prophetic language that was used. And then that can be misconstrued that Jesus was a hater of the non-Jews, which is ridiculous. And then he says that the followers of Jesus made him a lover of the Romans. So why would you make someone a lover of the Romans and then within the same text insult the Romans and everybody else who's not a Jew? So then he says that, well, he just keeps going and says that Jesus was a zealot, that an attitude that he was consistent with extreme anti-Romanism that he preached. So he claims that Jesus originally was anti-Roman and then was reworked, and I guess they forgot to take out that passage. While claiming to be Jewish Messiah, Jesus did so only in the Jewish historical sense of promised Jewish king who will arise to fight Israel's enemies, evict them from Israel, and reestablish Jewish sovereignty over the Holy Land. We'll get to that point. Fired by his religious zealotry, Jesus' intention was to lead a political insurrection against Roman occupation, for which he was killed. So the accusation of him being the king of the Jews was taken to mean that he was a monarch who was going against Rome. We'll get to that also. Luke 23:2 makes it abundantly clear that the charge against Jesus was political rebellion. We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the king. So I don't know if he's defending Caiaphas and his friends or he's working against them. We'll get to that as well. This is also why we find Jesus instructing his followers each to buy a sword in preparation for military action with the Roman cohort in the Garden of Gethsemane. So he makes the same mistake as liberation theologians who told the peasants in Latin America to pick up guns and shoot the bad guys, which they consider the bad guys, because Jesus told people to buy a sword. If you read the story, he's saying that you buy a sword for self-defense. And he tells Peter that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. They flip it and they say, oh, he was kidding. He actually wanted to kill everybody. And like we talked previously in other podcasts, Jesus is depicted in the book of Revelation as a warrior that fights and kills the enemies of God. But that's a later, it could be from the original perspective, but I don't know where he's going with this. Okay. The Romans ordered his swift execution because any claimant to the throne of David was met with instant crucifixion. That is something that our guest, John Dominic Crossan, would actually contend with history, where if they were truly revolutionaries, they would have killed them all. Because he was a pacifist, they only killed him to scare them all off. So again, you have to know what you're talking about before you make these claims. Jesus' enemy was therefore the corrupt Jewish high priest, Caiaphas, who was Rome's political muscle in Jerusalem, and he was despised by his fellow Jews as a collaborator. At least he gets that right. Indeed, Luke 13:31 makes it clear that the rabbis had previously saved Jesus' life, and the Pharisees later saved the lives of Peter, Paul, the rest of the apostles from execution by corrupt high priest and his cronies. This is in the book of Acts. And then he puts in capitals. You're not supposed to write an essay with capitals, because you're like, it's like a text where you're screaming. Many Jews today believe that the rabbis hated Jesus because he claimed to be divine, but he never made such claim. His often repeated expression, Son of Man, is common among Jewish prophets, especially Ezekiel. Likewise, Jesus' penchant for speaking in God's name in the first person singular is practiced by Moses in Deuteronomy and by Elijah in the book of Kings. Now that's pretty amazing that he would say something like that. Prophets often fail to distinguish between themselves and God, since they were deputized to speak in God's name. That is an amazing observation. Later, after millions of Jews were killed in the revolt of the year 66 to 70, the Gospels were edited to purge Jesus of any trace of anti-Roman vitriol. The story was changed to conflict between Jesus and the hated Jews rather than Jesus and the powerful Romans, but the editing was incomplete, and a great deal of the original story remains, especially since there were so many different gospel texts. Transformation of Jesus from lover of Israel to a sworn enemy of the Jewish people, with John 8 quoting Jesus as berating the Jews as children of Satan, were condemned to damnation in hell. It's a contemptible act of character manipulation that led to 2,000 tragic years of Christian anti-Judaism. Restoring Jesus to his Jewish roots, by contrast, could usher in a new era of Jewish Christian rapprochement. Jews and Christians may not meet through the same religion, but for the first time in 2 millennia, they can forge a bond of kingship using the personality of Jesus of Nazareth as a bridge, even though they continue to understand him in a completely different ways. So, wow. What do you think? I know you've heard the debate between him and the other gentleman that we will not discuss unless we get to one of his premises, which is he didn't even exist. And we'll do a pass and fail on him if in whatever book he has written, and I know you've read some of his books. But so that's pretty much his book. Mm-hmm. This idea that Jesus was a proto Bar Kokhba. And for those that are not familiar, Bar Kokhba was the Talmudic hero, because Rabbi Akiva saw him as a messianic figure, and then he got killed. So then Bar Kokhba is actually responsible for the rabbis pushing aside any apocalyptic ideas because they saw them as destructive. What people don't know is that the Jews did not only get enslaved and kicked out of Jerusalem in the year 70, they got kicked out of the land of Israel in the year 120, 130 when Bar Kokhba revolt happened. And they were able to reestablish themselves in Yavne, which is like in the outskirts, outside Galilee. So it was disastrous to have any messianic figure or an apocalyptic view. So they suppressed those views. So people see that as like they kept the prophecies away from the Jews and the reality of Jesus. In reality, they were trying to survive, because anytime you had a messianic figure, it wasn't good for the Jews. What so far, before we go to the pass or fail test, what are you thinking, Nick?
I think he makes some really good points, and I think it would do Christians well to study Yeshua more so from his Hebraic context. Um, I know there's a gentleman you're not too fond of, but he wrote a book called The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus, which did a pretty decent job of putting Yeshua back into his Hebraic context. Now he makes some other claims in there that you may or may not agree with, but um, yeah, that's one of the things I encounter a lot is, like I said, I have a lot of interaction with Christians or Christianity as a whole, um, and a lot of people they just their knowledge of the Tanakh, like you said, is very basic, and so they kind of just blindly accept. They have kind of what I call um, baby bird syndrome, where they just open up and whatever mama bird pastor regurgitates, they take it in without having actually studied anything in its context. And so I think he's right in the sense to that we do need to go back and look at Yeshua, Jesus, in his Hebraic context, and then I think Christians and Jews could actually move forward a lot in that regard. But um, there's some other stuff. Obviously, you're much more well versed on the Talmudic stuff than I am right now, and so what you mentioned about him saying this, that, and the other, like, the kippah with a beard and all that, like that stuff didn't come about for another period of time. So, um, no, I really don't have much else to add to it. You pretty
So,
much covered it.
for those that are not familiar, and I don't use the term Yeshua because it's already super loaded, just like the term Jesus and
Yeah.
Christ. His true name, Hebrew name, is Jehoshua Hanatsri or Jehoshua ben Yosef.
Mhm.
So I like to use it as an academic term. Joshua, son of Joseph, or Joshua the Nazarene, or whatever.
Yeah.
So I would stay away from that term, because then in the Talmud they use the term Yeshu,
Sure.
which means certain things, and then it means other things. So everything is already super loaded.
Yeah,
But
that's
what going to the pass or fail test that we're gonna do, he fails in multiple levels, and this is the issue. Um, just like every other author, he's creating Jesus into the image of what he thinks might be the case. So in an interview in 2004 during the Passion of the Christ controversy, he said something that was very revealing. He believed at that time, and then later in Kosher Jesus, he retracted, that Jesus actually um, survived the Bar Kokhba revolt. I mean, the it was actually the Cellar revolt of 70. That somehow Jesus fought during the Cellar revolt, and then he survived. So I don't know if he was watching the Last Temptation of Christ or where he got this from, because there's
Mhm.
no evidence of that anywhere. And that's just his musings. Like, well, he must have been a zealot. So we'll talk about Reza Aslan's book and other books like Maccabees who say that. But the ultimate conflict with what Rabbi Shmuley is bringing up is three things. And there's another author in a blog that says that he makes Jesus kosher under very strict rules. And these
Mhm.
rules are these. He says, for Jesus to be kosher, uh, Jews have to reject the Gospels and subsequent literature as inaccurate but historically useful. By wiping away the author's biases, we can discover the historical truth underlying the writings. So he does something that Geshe Bermesh and a couple other scholars do. They say the Gospels have multiple layers, and if you take them as they are, you actually have no room to work with. So you have to kind of like sort out truth and untruth and stuff like that. I don't think that to be the arbiter of that, that's a lot, because that's what the G seminary was doing, and they came up with some really weird ways to get there. I think that it would be more helpful to come up with um, different trains of thought, because what has happened in the past is that people come up with time periods. So they say, John was old, like newer, and Mark is older, Paul is older, and they try to say that those layers were developed at different times. The problem is that if Paul was younger in the progression, and the other stuff is older, Paul actually slams you with all these theological ideas that if you follow progression, he couldn't have come up with himself. So Paul says that Jesus is the image of God made man. If that was a later concept, how did Paul come up with it? And then you hear it in John, and you say, well, John is older, but Paul is already saying it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where some modern scholars come in and say, no, everything was there from the get-go. We'll get there in the future. The second thing that Shmuley demands is that the historical Jesus has to be a real person. His opponent, Tobias Singer, says that there's no evidence of that. It's impossible for us to find out. But it says he has to be a historical figure, and that's where you that's the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think that he's an amalgamation of a bunch of people, and they say that's not possible. So he has to be a real person. And then the third one is that reinterpreting Talmudic stories of Jesus as polemic or references to other people. So we already did that at the beginning of the show, where we said all the references to Jeshu and the Talmud are not really fully directed at Jesus. They're more of a polemic or a complaint against what they thought Jesus was, or they were talking about other people. And that's what Shmuley says in his book, that any time they mention a guy named Jeshu, they're not really talking about Jesus. But that's almost like hey, the Talmudic rabbis had no problem with Jesus. And the reality is they did, but they had a problem with the Jesus that was presented to them.
Yeah.
So he fails on the sense of the only historical Jesus is the one that he agrees with. He fails on the idea that Jesus has to be the messianic king that everybody assumes the Jews believe in, which is a warrior. The thing is that as much as King David was a warrior, as much as Abraham was a chieftain, as much as other biblical figures, even Moses was there when they were battling and he raised his hands, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
There is no evidence of that with Jesus, because he is the foundation of pacifism. To claim that the guy who inspired Martin Luther King and Gandhi to be pacifist was a warrior, it's to deny everything that was powerful about what he was teaching. I often say, if he was a zealot, he was the most terrible zealot in the universe, because he had no army, he had no plan, and if you study what, and we'll talk about the Passover plot and other ideas where he it was almost like a suicide mission. Like, he knew that what he was doing was going to get him killed. What plan is that?
Yeah.
He had to be like someone who had mental health concerns for him to say, I'm going to go and pick fights with everybody and God will deliver me. But that is something that is described in the story of the three men who were faithful to God and Daniel, and they went into the fire and the angels helped them.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of him as some type of martyr who believed in his ultimate vindication, he becomes that. So we have to look at that idea and later. But this idea that he was a proto-Bar Kokhba becomes suspect, because then again, Shmuley is claiming that he has the only view that is available on Jesus is that he has to be anti-Roman and he has to be someone who's trying to gather the people against the empire. And there was no way that a group of peasants who had no fighting skills would go against the Roman Empire. If you ever watched the show Spartacus, these were all gladiators and previous warriors from their own tribes. So they thought they could take down as many Romans as possible on the way out. But to have a carpenter, a fisherman, and a bunch of tax collectors and other random dudes trying to take on the Roman Empire, it's kind of like uh, the idea that musicians, poets, and accountants were able to fight the Nazis, and a lot of them ended up fighting the Nazis, and they never showed that in movies. They've only made one movie where the Jewish resistance against the Nazis was made up of a bunch of people who had to learn how to fight, and only a few survived, but at least they gave it a shot. So, and then the last thing to me shows that Shmuley is kind of getting he's rehashing all of McCovey's previous ideas. So he goes after Paul as someone that corrupted Jesus, and the previous scholar has all these conspiracy theories about Paul not really being a Jew and this and that. So they have to attack the mystic Paul, and then they have to create a Jesus that fulfills certain requirements that they think are going to make the Jewish community happy. So in this this article that I'm reading, they talk about multiple people who kind of gone back and kind of say, well, Jesus was a teacher, a holy man, had a lot of positive things going for himself, but this idea that he cannot be what Christianity teaches is also trying to define Christianity away from what you feel comfortable with. So if there was a sectarian group who believed that he was divine and he believed he was the Messiah, that shouldn't affect you. It's like there's a lot of people who believe a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. So why do you get so uneasy and so like shaken up? Because some people have these views. The only way that it would affect someone who's strong in their convictions is if they're saying something that brings doubt to your views. Yeah. So their own upbringing, their own conflict with Christianity is either the religion of the haters of the Jews or the religion of the guy who destroyed, the Jewish people through the centuries, which he says is part of their own kind of personal inner conflict. And the last thing that he said that it was very revealing was that he said that not only did Jesus create the religion that came after the Jews, but Jesus clearly denounces all Jews as children of Satan. That on itself is feeding into the anti-Semitic perspective, because if you read what it says, you also got to look at the whole text. So the guy who was writing the Gospel of John, whoever he was, or the 10 people who wrote it, are kind of out there, because not only in the passage of the woman of the well are very pro-Semitic, to the point of saying that anybody else who doesn't worship in the temple is confused and doesn't know what they're doing, and the salvation comes from the Jews. And then later on, they have this throwdown where he goes against the people who oppose him. So instead of thinking of the Jews are the children of the devil and they're liars and you got to think of the people who oppose him. So you're also assuming that all Jews oppose him. And him saying, Abraham will create children from the rocks and stuff like that, he's making a theological point. He's not making a ethnic or big condemnation. What he's saying is that if you oppose him, there's something sinister or evil behind it. If you look in the mystical writings, and this is where one of our guests, Dr. Michael Heiser, was talking about, he goes a little bit too far, but the idea is that if you believe in the demonic realm, if you believe that there are forces of good and evil, then you're going to side with whoever is on the good side or the bad side. So just like the Essenes who were saying, we are the children of light, our opponents are children of darkness, Jesus was saying, we are under divine mandate and we're pushing forward, and you guys are part of the armies of Armilus, which in the Dead Sea community is Roman pagans who are worshiping things that are not real. So for him to say that about religious Jews is a little problematic, but at that time they were blasting everyone. The Sadducees were the traitors who were working with the pagans, and the Pharisees that he was fighting, not all of them, were corrupting Judaism to the point of making it meaningless or making it demonic in the sense of it was working against the purposes of God. So we can debate later over Jesus was right to say that or to make that condemnation of those individuals, but to apply it to all Jews at all times, you're feeding into the anti-Semitic idea that there are representatives and that we all follow the Pharisees, which he does in that article, which again is incorrect because the Pharisees was one group. And the Talmud actually decries the Pharisees as being kind of not the whole picture of what Judaism is. So by not being fully aware of all these things, he kind of negates everything he's trying to do. He's trying to make Jesus into a bridge between Jews and Christians, and instead he makes him the Jesus that everybody knows is not the correct one, only his, but his is hidden under all these things, and then you gotta. So he's the only arbiter of which Jesus is the right Jesus, and the right Jesus has to be a warrior, and then a warrior that fails miserably and ends up getting killed, and then the people get all confused. So his premise does not pass on our test of fail and pass, because if he was the original Bar Kokhba, he would have been triumphant in some way, but he's failed in multiple things, and then that's not even what inspires people to believe in him or follow him. So again, it's a convoluted issue, but if you're going to make a claim, you have to run it through, and then most historians disagree completely with the scholar that he's trying to prop up as the only perfect scholar, which is Chaim Maccabee. So, and then he has all kinds of conspiracy theories related to his views on the other apostles and people like that. So that's what we'll do in every show. We will take a book or a concept that is applied to Jesus and then show the problems with it and how it leads to more confusion. So Nick, in the last 5 minutes, do you think that that's important to put these ideas to the test? Because you have to be familiar with both Judaism and Christianity to a great extent to be able to work this out. When someone just says, this is what I found, and it's someone who's as prominent as Rabbi Boteach, people are like, wow, this guy figured it out. But then you have to look at what he's saying, and there's so many issues that you start wondering, like, why was he even saying this to begin with?
Yeah.
Did you get that perspective? And there's one last thing I want to say about an interview he did with Israel National Radio, but go ahead.
Yeah, I do think it's very necessary to search these things out and put all these different aspects of what should I call him, just Jesus, all these different beliefs and ideas of who he is, who he was, what he should be, who he wasn't. Did he accomplish what he came to do? Did he not? Um, I think they should all be thoroughly tested because, I spent 10 years in a certain line of faith and I was pretty much in it, like I said, in an echo chamber. All I ever knew was hearsay. I knew very little of the Tanakh, um, even very little of what's called the New Testament. And, like I said, the Lord asked me the question, how do you know that what you believe is truth? And so I had to step back and I literally had to put everything to the test. And I'm still doing that currently. Um, I honestly feel slightly unprepared for like these conversations just because I'm still in that process of putting things through the test and finding out exactly where I stand. Um, and looking at them through all their different levels and layers. It's a lot of work, but yeah, absolutely. I think it's necessary. I think we should be putting these different ideas and opinions to the test, as you said, and yeah, working through it to kind of have an intellectual and like an actual real understanding for why we believe what we believe on one side of the coin or the other. Um, so yeah.
In defense of Rabbi Boteach, in the
Mhm.
interview that I mentioned, he says that there's 6 things that Jesus is accused of by the Pharisees, and that there is no evidence of him, actually doing those things. So I appreciate that as a legal scholar that he is, as a rabbi, he's
Mhm.
able to look at the evidence and say, okay, did he really break the Sabbath? Did he really tell his disciples to not wash their hands and be impure? Did he really do all those things? Because Shmuley is famous for being an anti-missionary, And he has gone as far as attacking people ad hominem, like saying that everybody who feels this way is this. So this is something that is not respectable in my view, but he has gone that in his passion and in his idea of trying to, kind of slap people to realize how destructive some of these ideas could be. But then he has to be consistent. So if he's going to defend the Jesus that he sees within the text of the New Testament, he has to follow through. So if the Pharisees were unfairly judging him and they accuse him of multiple things, then we have to see did he actually do them. So he helps build our case, and we'll discuss this in future shows, that if you look at the life of Jesus, he cannot be described as a heretic, as a sorcerer, as a idolater, or any of the other accusations that have been made against him. Again, if you do that unfairly, then you can't complain when people judge you unfairly. So part of being a Jew, which is the point of the show, we're describing Jesus as a Jew that veers off from the commandments of Torah, including through murder, idolatry, and sexual perversion, is someone who's cut off and someone who has no place in the world to come.
Yeah.
So if you're going to come after this founder of another religion or inspirational Jew who has impacted thousands of people, you have to have your story straight. You can't make accusations that are not founded on anything. If you don't feel that anything he said is of value, you shouldn't go around destroying someone's reputation. But again, if you don't even consider him a Jew, or if you consider him to be someone who came to destroy things, then the people feel like they have the right to do that. So again, we want a fair debate. We want a fair assessment of the situation, and we want people to follow their own standards, because Torah teaches that we should love our neighbors ourselves and that we should love God. So if someone speaks of God on God's behalf or whatever he did, we have to take into account what they said and evaluate it from the same, like Jesus said, with the rod that you were given. That's how you evaluate them, and then you will be evaluated from the same thing. So we're using Torah, Judaism, and historical critical thinking to be able to get there. Thank you for enjoying our show, hopefully, and we'll see you again next time.